Thank you all for tuning in this afternoon. Today's session is Understanding the Medical Field Through Storytelling with our featured speakers, Neal Baer and Suzanne Coven. And now, without further ado, let's turn things over to our speakers.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having Suzanne and me, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk today about storytelling, and it's drawn from the work that Suzanne and I do in our intensive at Harvard. We're on our third cohort. We have 60 students each time from around the world online. And I'm going to talk a bit about our new master's degree program, a Master of Science in Medicine, Media, and Health. So to begin, I'm going to talk about storytelling and storytelling for social change, particularly focusing on medicine. What do we mean by the impact of stories? Do stories make a difference? And we all know that stories make a difference to us emotionally, but do they change behavior? And if they do, how does that happen? And what's the best way to tell stories that can have an impact? So I'm going to begin with a story that is focused on medicine, and that's human papillomavirus and cervical cancer. About 4,300 women in the US die each year from a preventable disease, a virus, HPV, that causes cervical cancer in almost all cases of cervical cancer. The WHO estimates that over 300,000 women die each year from cervical cancer. So I wanted to know if we would have an impact in the story that we told. So I designed an episode of ER that was about total maybe 8 or 9 minutes out of the 45 minutes of the show. And we did the first study of its kind to assess whether the show had any impact. So I'm going to show you a few clips from the show and then tell you what we found out.
We're afraid we might have caught something.
Well, what do you think you might have caught?
We heard some syphilis was going around school.
I see. Why don't you girls come with me?
What did we learn? Do our stories make an impact? And the answer is they do indeed, and we were pretty shocked to find out. I worked with the Kaiser Family Foundation and Princeton Survey Research. We surveyed over almost 1,000 viewers of ER before the show aired. We did not tell them that the show was airing. The show was the experimental treatment, and then we resurveyed a random sample of viewers a week later and 6 weeks later, and here were the results. First, we found out that over half the people who watched the show learned important health issues from our show, and they talked with friends about it. They got health information, a third of them, from the show. A quarter of them went to other sources, and 1 out of 7 went to their doctor because of something, or healthcare provider because of something they saw on the show, which really alarmed us in some ways and made us really focus on giving as accurate information as possible. Yes, we do say there's a stat pap smear, which really doesn't exist, but we did use the fact that you do use a pap smear to detect cervical cancer.
Andrew, we got your test results. They found some abnormal cells in your pap smear. You might have cervical cancer. We need to do a biopsy just to make sure.
Cancer? Is it caused by having sex?
Well, you get it from an infected partner. It's called HPV, human papillomavirus. But not everybody with HPV
No, you
has
can't
cervical...
tell my parents.
Andrea, if you have this, you need to be admitted to the hospital.
Anyway, they're in Europe. You said everything I told you was confidential.
If you're not treated, you could get very sick.
We always endeavored to be as accurate as possible. And this led to what's called the Hollywood Health and Society program at USC, funded by Norman Lear, where they provide accurate health information to any writer in Hollywood now, and they've been doing it for over 20 years. And it came out of ER and the need for accurate information, because I was calling all my professors and asking for information, and they were providing it. And so many of them went on to be consultants on the show and to talk about their specialties to writers in Hollywood. We found out that the percent of ER viewers who could correctly define HPV, this is before the vaccine Gardasil came out. This was in early 2000, 2001, 9% before the show and almost 30% after. And then it always decreases 6 weeks later, which is why we like to have repeats. But really, seriously, we like to have communication projects where it's not just the show, but we use many different sources to promote this information. And then stunningly, before the show aired, 20% approximately knew that HPV causes cervical cancer, is associated with cervical cancer, up to 60%, and then down to about 40. So in order to change your behavior, you must have the knowledge. And so this really was the beginning of my work, coming back to Harvard and doing this program with Suzanne and the master's degree, which Suzanne teaches in as well, because we know that stories have an impact. So hopefully I've shown you this. This was published in the journal Health Affairs. And since then, many, many studies have been done to show that people do learn about organ transplantation and driver's licenses and et cetera from television and from social media. So what exactly makes stories have an impact? And I talk about going from the data to the emotion. So what does that mean? Well, you saw on the pathway is very torn about what to do.
I don't know. Both girls have been going to these sex parties at school friends' houses.
Oh my God, at their age?
I promised her I wouldn't tell her folks, and legally I can't.
Well, wait, she's a minor and she needs surgery.
Well, maybe I can talk her into letting me tell her parents.
Carol, I understand you don't want to break confidentiality, but this is a public health issue now. At least one of those boys is spreading HPV. And the girls at those parties all need to have pelvic exams and pap smears. So whatever she says, you also need to call the school.
She is concerned that there's a public health issue with these young women being exposed to HPV. She's promised confidentiality, which legally she has to do, and yet there's a public health issue because people are spreading HPV. So through her character, through this one person, we told this story. So Psychic Numbing and Genocide by Paul Slovic is a work that I use that's really influenced my work in Hollywood to tell stories. And why do we love movies, novels, TV shows, poetry, music, photography, painting, memoir? What we call in this talk is storytelling modalities. These are the modalities that move us emotionally. What works and what doesn't work in moving the needle in public health. So we turn to Paul Slovic for his path-breaking work. And he said, there's no constant value for a human life, that the value of a single life diminishes against the backdrop of a larger tragedy. And he calls that the singularity effect, which is an individual life is very valued. We all go to great lengths to protect a single individual or to rescue someone in distress. But then as the numbers increase, we don't respond proportionally to that. And if you think about any kind of, if you think about COVID and the pandemic and over 900,000 people who have perished, it's really hard to conceptualize that. But if you have taken care of someone, or you know someone, or someone in your family has gotten COVID and passed away, it resonates for you. It's that one who resonates. And so we're going to talk about that. And Suzanne will talk about that in the work she does too. So people care about individuals. We see it over and over again. There's a child who needs an operation. His parents can't afford to pay for it. And there's a story in the news. An outpouring of money, donations, and support is often tremendous. We do care a lot about individuals. We don't scale that up even when we're capable. So examples would be refugees, or the number of people, as I just said, dead from COVID. These dramatic stories of individuals, or photographs, or television shows, or novels, etc., give us a window of opportunity where we're suddenly awake and not numbed, and we want to do something. If there's something we can do, like donate to the Red Cross, or people will do it. But then if there's nothing else they can do, over time, their passion gets turned off again. So partial solutions can make a difference. It's not that there's one solution that can fix the world's problem in terms of equity and health, but many different solutions, many ways of telling stories can make a big difference. Here's a quote from Mother Teresa: "If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will." And so this came from a work that Paul Slovic did. He's at the University of Oregon. psychologist, and it's called Psychic Numbing and Genocide. He's been hugely influential, not only on me and my storytelling and telling the stories of individuals, but also on Nick Kristof, who's the op-ed writer and Harvard alum for the New York Times, and also Daniel Kahneman. All cite the Nobel Prize winner in economics, all cite the profound work of Paul Slovic. So most people are caring, and they'll exert great effort to reserve the one whose needy plight comes to their attention. But these same people often become numb or numbly indifferent to the plight of the one who is one of many and a much greater problem. So that's what we mean by psychic numbing. When it's one, we can relate. When it starts to become more than one, we start to turn off, we become numb to it. And I think it's because there are many, I'm investigating this in terms of the neurobiology of our brains and the neurostructures of our brains, but also it's hard to understand what the numbers really mean when you start to think about these huge numbers. Numbers alone don't move people, and Paul Slovic has shown this in some experiments that I'll show you. The data often inspire us, like I was inspired when I read a real story about kids in North Carolina who were exposed to syphilis, and I made this story up to dig into the issue of HPV and cervical cancer. And I looked at the data and I was shocked because people were dying women were dying when they needn't because they were not getting pap smears. It's changed now because of Gardasil, but still a lot of people haven't been vaccinated and they're contracting cervical cancer. The data must be accompanied with narratives or visuals or some kind of emotional push, and in order to prevent psychic numbing. Our capacity to feel, unfortunately, is limited. We can think of lots of examples of that. So the collapse of compassion. So Paul Slovic did an experiment where he talked about a child who was food insecure. And then he told a story to an experimental group of people that he told the story, and it was a child and his sister. And then it was a child and his sister in a village. And it was a child and his sister in the village and a country. And not surprisingly, given what I've just told you, people donated to this child. The greatest compassion was feeling like you could accomplish something with one. And once you started to go to two, it really diminished. So a good example of that would be these two graphs where the number of how should we value human lives versus how do we value human lives. Every life has equal value and large losses are valued more. But with psychic numbing, the number of lives you can see decreases. As it increases, the value decreases. We can't, and this has been shown experimentally by Slovic and others now, that it's hard for us to consider what it means and what we can do about it. I'm not saying that there's nothing we can do about it. Of course, we have the UN, we have political organizations and Congress and political structures to try to deal with large numbers, but we see, unfortunately, how they often fail. An example of how to apply Slovic's ideas. How many plastic soda bottles are dumped into the ocean each year? Well, the answer is about 20 to 34 billion plastic soda bottles. So it's like, ooh, what does that mean? It's incomprehensible. What can I do about it? But let me show you a quick story that had huge impact.
Okay, I'm filming. You can go for it, Mr. Surgeon. She's going to be so happy. A big bottle.
Careful. Bless you.
Have you ever heard turtles sneeze?
I have. You know what this is?
What is it? Swabs, the sterile swabs. Could you put them into the iodine and then we're just gonna try to clean it? No, pero no es un hook por lo menos.
Sí, yo lo intento. Sí, yo ahorita lo mordí. Yo lo mordí ahorita y es plástico.
He bit on it and he said it's plastic. I'm gonna let it out already.
As you probably recall, that many communities around the country banned plastic straws after they saw this story and this story of the sea tortoise. It moved them. Whereas if I tell you 20 to 34 billion bottles, it's like, whoa, what do we do about that? I don't know. It's really tough. So again, data and emotion lead to action, as we've seen where people learned about HPV, and then we hope that they will take the action, but they can't take the action if they don't know what the consequences are. So in terms of taking action, I'm going to show you where a very quick illustration of that. I heard a story from a woman maybe about 10 or 12 years ago who was afraid to leave her home because she'd been sexually assaulted. And her rape kit, which is done after an assault is reported, can take between 5 and 7 hours, where the nurse typically does a scrupulous job of collecting evidence, and it's often re-traumatizing, as you can imagine, to the victim. So I was inspired by that story, and I made it an episode of Law and Order Special Victims Unit. Here is a very brief clip of what the problem is.
Houston, they have a backlog of 4,000 rape kits. He says he'll get me the results when he has them.
We've counted almost 7,000 kits. We think there might be as many as 16,000 kits here.
Have any of them been tested?
So far, only about 1,200.
I wonder how many guys like Harris could have been stopped if those rape kits had been tested.
How did we take that story and move, or I often say bridge the gap between inspiration and action? So many people saw this episode. So we put information out on NBC's website and on their outreach site. And Mirshka and I wrote a piece for the Huffington Post. And she wrote and testified. She wrote a piece for her nonprofit, and we testified before Congress. And we partnered with Human Rights Watch, which gave us material for a kit that you could watch, a toolkit for watching the show and how to go to your chief of police or your city council to open the backlog of rape kits. So we're giving people actionable steps based on being inspired by this story played by Jennifer Love Hewitt in that episode, and Mariska's feelings about we're telling the victims that they don't matter by the actions that we're taking or not taking. And then I partnered with Nick Kristof, and you can see he bit.ly'd right here the piece that you just saw, and he noted every 2 minutes someone is raped in the US. US law doesn't require DNA evidence to be tested. Learn more, you'd bit.ly it, and then we could take you to various websites. And this was Human Rights Watch. It was their domestic issue that they really focused on. And we gave, as I said, toolkits. Take Part is the company participant that does documentaries like Al Gore's documentary and movies as well. And we wanted to expand the Venn diagram. You know, you have Nick Kristof and Huffington Post. So we went to Good Housekeeping, US News, Ms. Blog, and then many, many different places to end the backlog. And then did we have an impact? Well, as you can see, there are actions taken. These states have cleared their backlog at this point, which is incredible. And these other states, as you can see, have enacted full legislative rape kit reform. And by doing this, often people who have committed these crimes who are on the street are picked up because they're in the system. But if you don't open the rape kit, just as if you don't know HPV causes cervical cancer, you're not going to do anything about it. So we were giving actionable steps to people, which is how we try to approach this. So here, I'm going to switch now that this work that I've done, and I've been very fortunate to do on television, and I'm going to talk to Suzanne in a moment. We're very lucky as writers, she and I, and as physicians, to be able to draw on our artistic passions as well. So these are all the storytelling modalities that we cover in our intensive at Harvard, which is called Media and Medicine, storytelling that makes a difference. And they're also the modalities that we cover in our new master's degree program that's starting in the fall. And Suzanne and I teach a course on storytelling modalities. And it's a Master of Science, as I said, in Media, Medicine, and Health, the first of its kind in the country. And it's a one-year master's program. It's mass media, narratives, arts. This is where I'm on the set of Under the Dome, based on Stephen King's novel. We train in theories and methods of storytelling and social medicine. And we have a mentored capstone project as the culmination of the second semester. These are the questions driving our program. I won't read them, but they are very focused on health equity and justice, on research, grounding our storytelling in science, as I said, starting with the data and then telling an emotional story that can have an impact, and then giving people actionable steps to take so that they can make a difference. And our fall semester is called Exploration. So we're giving our students all kinds of work in our storytelling modalities that Suzanne and I teach. Suzanne teaches us a course also in definitions in illness and health, identifying social forces in healthcare, resocializing approaches, visual project, storytelling and budgeting, qualitative and quantitative analyses. And then it ends in the spring semester with the curation, where they have directed readings based on their project. So let's say they want to do a project, vaccinations and HPV again, where the numbers have somewhat gone down. They would do that research. They would see what's effective, what works, what doesn't. They would do a paper, and then they would design a capstone project that covers and draws on at least one modality. We were very fortunate to have the resources at Harvard to give them access to podcasting or making documentaries as well. And that's how I got my start in visual and environmental studies. I made documentary films when I was a graduate student at Harvard in sociology that changed my life. And then the last thing is, this is just a very brief curriculum map of what we're teaching. And so these are all the core courses that our students will be taking. They'll do a January intersession with Jay Winston, who designed Designated Driver. So we have really the world's authority on how to do a media campaign that's had a profound influence. Now the Designated Driver is often Uber and Lyft. And you can see this is the course Suzanne's teaching. We're teaching this course together. This is a course that sadly for us and profoundly the late Paul Farmer taught, and had such a huge impact across Harvard and across the world. And then in the spring, we do a visual narratives and design thinking course, and then we really focus on social medicine pro seminar and an elective, so that whatever modality they're choosing, our students can go across Harvard and explore that modality through the Department of Theater, Dance, and Media, or in what was once called Visual and Environmental Studies, or at the School of Design, or the Divinity School, or the Ed School, or wherever there's a course that fits what they're interested in. And so that is my brief talk, or a little bit. So I'm going to switch now, and I'm going to talk to Suzanne and have Suzanne speak about how she changes lives and her own life through storytelling. As was mentioned, Suzanne is the writer in residence at Mass General, which is and an internist. So she's a practicing physician, and she's also a writer. She has a new book that is really profound about her life as a young physician, and then moving through her practice and her experiences. And it's called A Letter to a Female Physician, and I highly recommend it. So Suzanne, how do you, I told my story about how I take television. I'm inspired by data. I try to make an emotional story focused on one character. Of course, there are other characters, and then I give people actionable steps. What motivates you, Suzanne, to write what you write, your essays, your memoir? What do you look for? What drives you as a storyteller, and what impact have you had?
Well, thanks so much for having me, Neal. I have to just interject to your point, something I happened to see right before this, and which many of our audience probably have seen, which beautifully tragically illustrates your point, which is that there is a video today going viral of on all the news outlets and social media venues, which is of a young Ukrainian man about to go off to war, tearfully saying goodbye to his daughter and adjusting her wool winter cap on her head over and over again, this little white cap. And the poignancy of a father and a daughter and a white cap, and the ability of those to, make us weep in ways that maps with arrows don't, I think very much illustrates your point.
And we'll never forget that, right, Suzanne?
I will never forget the white wool hat and the little pink ski jacket. In the same way that we all remember the image of the boy face down on the beach, the 3-year-old boy face down on the beach. I think that this is just the way we're wired to be responsive to individual stories. So my path is that I have to say that I lived the beginning of my medical career under a misconception, and the misconception was that my passion for writing and for literature, which I'd indulged as an English major in college, were pretty much irrelevant to my life as a doctor. You sort of, as the saying goes, you pays your money and you makes your choice. And I thought that I had kind of thrown my lot in with science and medicine and left the humanities as really a hobby. But what I really noticed, I think, from the outset of my career, and began to articulate to myself more and more as time went on, is that storytelling is the fundamental currency of medicine. We have different words for it in medicine. We call it morning rounds, grand rounds, consults, taking a history, writing a progress note. It's all just storytelling. And it really wasn't until I was sort of a veteran clinician that I decided to go back to graduate school to start writing professionally. And then only in the last few years that I've developed this role at Mass General, where I'm coaching healthcare workers in writing, and there are many healthcare workers who want to write for reasons that I can elaborate on in a moment, and also running reading and writing workshops. It turns out that doctors, nurses, chaplains, administrators, sitting around a conference table at night or a Zoom lately, talking about Shakespeare or Alice Munro or whoever, it has everything to do with taking care of patients and also taking care of ourselves. So let me pause there. I know there are a ton of questions in the Q&A, but I'm happy to talk more about the ways in which storytelling is relevant to practice.
Before we're going to take some questions, but could you just talk a little bit about memoir and essay, because that's really your arena. And, when we work with our students, some of them are doing poetry and some are doing memoir. What drives you to do what you do?
Right. Well, I really do think that for those of us who have the impulse to write, the genre in which we write sort of chooses us. And if we were meant to be essayists, as I seem to be, you can pretend to be a novelist, but it may not work out. There are people, one thinks of Margaret Atwood, for example, who are novelists and poets and essayists and critics. But most of us mere mortals are kind of have one lane. And for me, it's the personal essay. And my book is a collection of personal essays that in aggregate become a memoir. What I love about essays is, the term essay is, it comes from the French essayer, to try. And it really is a form of thinking aloud on the page. You take something that you don't understand. It might be something about your own past, or a patient interaction, or an issue in the world that you don't understand, your own feelings about. And then, as Joan Didion famously said, you write to find out what you know. And I often tell the folks I coach in writing that if you already know the punchline, don't bother writing it, because the great joy in it is the discovery. And in writing my book, I mean, there were episodes from my past that, like all of us, we have our sort of standard tropes, our standard tapes. We think we know, why this happened and why that happened. And I sort of picked them up and examined them one by one and said, hey, wait a minute, what? I really thought that really happened. And that turned out to be a very fruitful basis for essay writing.
And a very honest series of essays that are quite moving. So I recommend it to everyone. So we're going to thank you, Suzanne. We're going to go to some questions. The first one I'll answer because it's, what advice do you have for doctors interested in getting started in television writing? Well, if you're Harvard affiliated, you can go to Harvardwood, and it provides incredible resources, harvardwood.org, for people who write television and movies and want to get into it. And it's networking, it's sessions, it's meeting agents and managers, it's meeting studio executives, because so many people have come out of Harvard in grad schools and are working in the business, as we say. And so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is you have to write a script. So if you really want to get into TV, you have to write a script, and you can go online and read scripts. Now, what's really like kind of the secret of TV is that most medical series are inspired by or have Harvard people writing them. So ER was written by Michael Crichton. And then I came on at the very beginning to write while I was a fourth year medical student, going back and forth. David Foster, who was my colleague in medical school, is the writer, producer, doctor of House, and now of New Amsterdam. And Daniela Lamas, who is an intensivist at the Brigham, writes on a show called The Intern. And The Intern was created by a fellow who's in radiation oncology. So we're like all over medical shows, which I think is really interesting that there are a lot of medical schools, but we've been very fortunate to be the ones who are leading the charge. So you need to write a spec script, or if you want to be a consultant, then you have to, I would say, to go on the website, Hollywood Health and Society, and read what they're doing. And then you can offer your services to them if you want to advise writers based on your expertise and specialty. The next question is there a successful example of storytelling that moved the needle to improve health disparities? The answer is yes, in terms of many different, there are many different studies that have come out of Hollywood Health and Society, and so that have had an impact in terms of genetic testing, in terms of who has access to them, in terms of access to to drugs, and access to insulin. We did a story about access to insulin on Designated Survivor, and it's really, moved the needle. Not necessarily that one episode, but it's a collection of stories that has moved the Biden administration to really talk about this incredible increase in the cost of insulin. So we've seen, in terms of my own work, it's hard to measure an exact impact, but we know from that study that I first did that people learned about HPV. And so, Suzanne, do you have any thoughts about that? The successful example of storytelling that moved the needle to improve health disparities?
Well, I think there's tons of them, not least of which is, I believe, on the front page of the New York Times today. I think there's follow up to the story of, I think I have this right, of the Black physician who died giving birth, and highlighted the high incidence of maternal mortality in Black women. The thing is, individual stories humanize, right? So, the little girl in the white hat is not a statistic anymore. And I think that once someone is humanized, it's really sort of hard to see the issue, including disparities, in the same way. But maternal mortality, stories of the Black physician who died of COVID, who sort of gave testimony from her ICU bed about the way she was being treated and the racism she experienced while receiving medical care. I mean, these kind of firsthand accounts, I think, are incredibly powerful in highlighting disparities.
We asked our students to, I've asked students to take a data point that's inspired them and to then talk about what modality they would use based on Linda Villarosa's work. And Linda came and talked to our students. She was inspired because she saw that almost 1 out of 2 Black men in the South who have sex with men are HIV positive, even though we have medication to prevent HIV, to prevent acquiring HIV, and to prevent transmitting HIV. So we really shouldn't have any HIV infections in the US. We have now more than almost any place in the world in terms of percentage. And the answer lies in stigma, access, justice, equity, cost, other cultural attitudes. And so, as Suzanne is saying, we think that getting the stories out there, she wrote that piece. It was a cover story for the New York Times. It's an accrual of stories as well. It's not just one necessarily, unless it's something like the one today with the little girl in her hat or the little boy on the beach from Syria. So we all we have the attitude in our courses that we all can contribute by telling very heartfelt, emotional stories grounded in data. So I'm going to go to this next. This is a question that I know Suzanne gets all the time. And it is, how do you balance using images and narration to provoke empathy without reducing individuals into tropes or taking away their agency and dignity?
What a great question. So, this really gets to this fundamental question of whose story is it? And a question of appropriation. This was a big topic of conversation in our media and medicine course today. And I think that there's a couple of ways, and it really depends on the kind of writing that you're doing. I think if you're doing memoir, personal essay, perspective pieces like that, I think you have to remember that you're telling your story, and that you're seeing other people through the lens of your narration. It's an irony. We were talking about this today, or I should say a paradox, that by acknowledging that this is your story, you are less likely to risk appropriation. Now, if you're doing a different kind of writing, say reporting, I think that it's incredibly important to gather accounts from the people that you're writing about. And we all have read, journalism where there's a whole lot of facts, but the voice of the people being written about is missing entirely. So I think it depends on the kind of writing you're doing. For most of us in medicine, who feel compelled to write about our interactions with patients. I think that we want to realize that what we're writing is not our patients' stories, we're writing our stories, and be very upfront about that. Unless we're writing sort of, medical mysteries and, the kind of thing that Lisa Sanders does in her diagnosis column. But otherwise, it's your story. It's not the patient's story in that case.
And we were talking, as Suzanne said today, with our students about this very issue. And a good example came up where one of our students was doing an intervention for type 2 diabetes within a community where people have a rightful fear of the medical establishment because they haven't been embraced and taken in or understood, and there are language barriers and things we see across the country and across the world. And I suggested, and I found this, that when we talk about giving voice to people, we're saying that we are the ones giving voice by telling our stories. And I think that, for me, is paternalistic. It's like, it's not really for us to give voice, but we can, and I suggested as a possible project for her is to give people, or to encourage them, to give them disposable cameras, or to give to the ones who have iPhones that have video, to document when are they hypoglycemic, when are they needing to take more insulin, when are they finding that their insulin is not enough, et cetera, all the things that they go through. And then that can be used for the story. And we call that participatory storytelling, or participatory filmmaking, or photography. And that way, I think it helps us that we're partners, and we may have the tools, but we give those tools to people and say, you're the ones to tell your stories. That's why Suzanne is making the point that when we're writing, and we're writing about ourselves, then that's one thing. But when we're telling stories of other people, we have to be very cognizant of appropriation and what we're doing. So we think about that a lot. And it's not an easy path, because it's not just so straightforward, but it's something that we think about. So these are all great questions. How do you balance your creative and medical endeavors, especially while applying to and while in medical school? Well, when I was in medical school at Harvard, I actually made a documentary, and David, I mentioned David because he's now on New Amsterdam. He assisted me, and that's when he fell in love with filmmaking. And I made a film about people who work all night while I was in medical school. And it's hard, of course, because you're focused, but you can do all kinds of things. Like, you can, if you're a medical student, you can take our master's degree at HMS between your third and fourth year. And you can do these things in medical school by doing, our master's degree, or a master's degree at the Kennedy School, or School of Public Health, or the business school, where Divinity School, ed school. We have many, many different programs that focus on people's passions. We have a number of medical students at HMS who do medical education with the ed school and learn how to design and devise programs to improve medical education. So there are ways to do it in medical school, but I think and just reading stories, I think, are really is really important. But how do you do it? And Suzanne can really speak to this, because I'm not a practicing physician now, but Suzanne is. So how do you, Suzanne, manage storytelling, your writing, and seeing patients?
I almost don't even see them as different things anymore. But what I would say, if you're in medical school or training, I would say, first of all, don't do what I did. Don't assume that you can't incorporate this into your life. And also, don't get discouraged by, seeing that, this one is publishing everywhere and that one's publishing everywhere. And, your the kind of stories that you have to tell may take longer to tell. There are a lot of very young clinicians who are, and even medical students who are publishing and doing great work, but that doesn't have to be your path. What I would say in terms of incorporating it is really to sort of dispense with the idea that there are barriers. If you join or start a reading or writing group, or take a writing course, this is not irrelevant to your work as a clinician. It has everything to do with your work as a clinician. And I would say that becoming a writer made me a much better doctor, and certainly a much happier doctor. So take heart. It not only can be done, I would argue that it should be done. I think it greatly enriches our experience and our effectiveness.
There's a question, this speaks to Suzanne, what one of our students did today. With so much information and misinformation on the internet, do you have any general rules to follow to help sort out legitimate from quackery information? And I think it's interesting because our student had a mnemonic, and I can't, it flew by, but essentially what she said was that if the information comes with a price tag, selling something, isn't cited in peer-reviewed work. There were some other things.
If it's really on a .com website.
Yes, if it's not a .com.
If it's a .com website, it's probably not good. Yeah, that there are
exactly. So I mean, that's the challenge of our times, of course. I mean, we see that in COVID, and we see that in ivermectin and all the hydroxychloroquine, et cetera, that, people want definitive answers. They want something that will work. And maybe we're at fault for kind of pushing that notion that we can have something that can work, like a vaccine that works. Yes, but that was a process, and people still have breakthrough COVID. So it's not definitive, and people, I think, want definitive. We can be very definitive about measles because measles research has been around for decades, but it's a novel virus. And so we don't have that. And so it's really important that we as physicians, healthcare providers, concerned citizens really talk to people about science is a process. It's as I said, an accrual of data, and it's often changing. And if it were definitive at this point, we wouldn't be where we are. So we still don't know about long COVID. There's new information coming out every day about who's susceptible to long COVID. And we know, for instance, that people with type 2 diabetes are more susceptible. We didn't know that at first. We had to gather the data. And so this is something that's really challenging for people. Suzanne, what are your
Well,
thoughts?
I mean, there's another aspect of this that comes up a lot in practice, which is how do we maintain a therapeutic alliance and empathy for people who are making decisions based on disinformation and misinformation. This obviously has come up a lot in practice in the last couple of years, and I think the answer is the same. It's understanding that there's a story, and that, not everybody who refuses vaccines is a moron who deserves our scorn, that there may be a story. And if you engage the story, your chance of changing the person's mind or at least maintaining a therapeutic relationship are much greater. There's one question in the box we have to answer, which is about medical school applications. Yeah, the answer is the same. It's storytelling. I read a lot of medical school applications. It's a little hobby of mine. I love helping people out with this. And what I always say is that in your essay, you need to tell the story of why you want to be a doctor. You need to tell a story that leaves the reader thinking, yeah, this makes total sense that this person wants to be a doctor. Okay. So, it's kind of all the same principle.
I always ask my students, whether they're in public health or in medical school, what brought them here? I said, you're not out selling, well, you might be selling real estate, but I haven't really met anybody in my class who's doing that. So why are you here as a public health, a graduate student in public health or a medical student? What is that experience? Is it personal? Is it about your family? Is it about your friend? Is it about somebody you saw? Is it about a trip you made when you were a college student? What is it that pushed you in this direction? And that's a way to start thinking about this. I think one very last point we'll make is that they asked about the visual, and how do you make your storytelling visual? In a variety of ways. You don't have to be a TV writer. You can use your cell phone and make a video, and there's all kinds of software online now to edit. Suzanne brought on a comic writer who's a physician for our course, and she does comics. We have graphic novelists, we have photographers, any kind of visual. The person who's the head of the residency program, Joel Katz, at the Brigham in internal medicine, is a painter. So you find your visual passion, and if that's where it lies, then you do the work that you love. Maybe we had a student today who's doing photography and mental illness and depicting people in a way that bursts stereotypes. So you find that passion, and if it's poetry, we had a student today with poetry, then you go with it. It doesn't have to be visual. It can be poetry. It can be Suzanne's essays that turn into a book that move people. So I think we're going to have to end. Suzanne, it's always so great to have you and chat with you. And we have a lot of fun together. So we've been very fortunate, and we really want to thank the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at Harvard Medical School, who they have given us the opportunity to do something that I never thought would be possible. So thank you all. Thanks, Suzanne.
Thank you, Neal, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you, Neal and Suzanne, and thanks to all of you who joined us today. We hope you'll join us for more signature events. Information on upcoming events as well as recordings of our past events can be found at vpel.harvard.edu/vpel-events. Good night, everyone. Thank you for being a part of the conversation.